Well, good morning, everybody. We're standing here on the banks of an important river, at least important in our text today. And I want to thank you for being here. I do want to let you know that helping out with this effort, standing behind the camera each and every week, I want you to say hi to the people, Becky. There she is. Maybe you caught that. I don't know. You know how Becky loves the spotlight, so she's not coming out from behind the camera, but she's helping out each and every week. And some of you have asked, hey, for updates and such. Well, the difficulty with doing that in this setting is that because we're filming and then recording, editing, producing, and posting, by the time the video actually shows, whatever information or updates given could be a little old by then. So maybe we'll come up with some other way to do that. But we're doing well. Just simply trying to get used to kind of a new normal right now. Howard seems to be re-energized by our presence and is doing a little bit better, a lot better actually, showing some more energy and such. So we're glad that he's found a new exuberance for life, at least since we've gotten back here. But we want to go ahead and get to the text today. So if you'll turn to the book of Joshua, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Grumblers, Deuteronomy, Second Law, and then Joshua. We'll go to Joshua chapter 1 this morning. And again, shout out to those veterans who have provided us with the freedom to be able to do this, both preach, post, and gather for worship with freedom. And I think each and every year, month, and even day, it becomes more apparent how valuable the freedom they gained for us truly is. So thank you to all of you. Joshua this morning. We left off with the people of Israel staging right outside the Promised Land. So for us today, we're outside the Promised Land. It's over there for a visual image. And Moses, while they were in the staging area, getting ready to go in and feast upon the land flowing with milk and honey, repeated the law in Deuteronomy to them, saying, do you remember all that God had done? Don't forget, and especially don't forget when you go in to that new land. Now, they are outside the border for about 1.5 months waiting to go in. Why so long? Well, after a couple of weeks, when Moses died, and repeating that law to them, they mourned for him. In fact, I know you're there in Joshua. If you just go back maybe one page in your Bible to Deuteronomy 34, it's probably just a page. Deuteronomy 34, verse 8 says, and the people of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. So why waiting 1.5 months? Well, 30 days were days of mourning, and then, still verse 8, the days of weeping and mourning for Moses were ended. And now we find ourselves in the book of Joshua. Now, if you remember, Joshua was one of 2 of the faithful spies who went in, he along with Caleb, who 38.5 years earlier than this, where we're at today, they went in to spy out the land. And this book is named after him. Now, if you look at Joshua chapter 1, verse 1, let's read a couple verses. It says, after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, what a great epitaph, the Lord said to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' assistant. Verse 2, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan. What's this Jordan? It's a river. The Jordan River that would lead them into the Promised Land. You can see kind of where they're at on this map, staging, and how they would get into that Promised Land would be by crossing the Jordan River. You, verse 2, and all this people, that is, go into the land that I'm giving to them, whom? To the people of Israel. Now jump down to verse 5. Says, no man shall be able to stand before you, Joshua, all the days of your life, for just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you, and I will not leave you nor forsake you. Jump down to verse 10. And Joshua commanded the officers of the people, pass through the midst of the camp and command the people, prepare your provisions, for within 3 days you are to pass over this Jordan to go into and take possession of the land that the Lord your God is giving you to possess. Now here's kind of a funny. Joshua says, hey, let's get ready. We're going to go in. They know he's in charge now. Here's a funny thing. Look at verse 16 in Joshua chapter 1. And they answered Joshua, verse 16, all that you have commanded us, we will do. And wherever you send us, we will go. Verse 17, just as we obeyed Moses in all things, so we'll obey you. Now, do you think that was encouraging to Joshua? Hey, just as we obeyed Moses, when they grumbled and they complained and they nearly overthrew his leadership and they said, hey, if we'd only died back in Egypt, maybe we should raise up a coup and go back to Egypt. But just as we obeyed Moses, Joshua, we're going to do the same for you. Yeah, there's an encouraging, kind of like, hey, we just threw this gold into the fire and pop, out came a calf. Pretty funny. Nevertheless, they promised the obedience. Now look at Joshua chapter 3, verse 1. Then Joshua rose early in the morning, chapter 3, verse 1, and they set out from Shittim, and they came to the Jordan, he and all the people of Israel, and lodged there before they passed over. Now jump down to verse 14 in chapter 3. So when the people set out from their tents to pass over the Jordan with the priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant before the people, and as soon as those bearing the Ark, here it is, came as far as the Jordan, and the feet of the priests bearing the Ark were dipped in the brink of the water. Now why is that important? Look at this next phrase. For the Jordan overflows its banks throughout this time of harvest. It's at flood stage. In verse 16, the waters coming down from above stood up and rose up in a heap very far away at Adam, the city that is beside Zarethan, and those flowing down toward the sea of the Arabah, or the Salt Sea, were completely cut off, and the people passed over opposite Jericho. Now verse 17, and the priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stood firmly on the dry ground in the midst of the Jordan. On dry ground. Not ground without water. Not muddy ground, but dry ground. And all Israel was passing over on dry ground until all the nation finished passing over the Jordan. Now we hear all the time about crossing of the Red Sea. How come we don't hear more about the crossing of the Jordan? I think it's just as miraculous. In both cases, water was stopped in its natural flow and dry ground appeared for Israel, a nation numbering millions, to walk through. And that they did on the Jordan River as it stopped its flow and miraculously dried up and allowed them to pass over. Out through a dried up Red Sea, in through a dried up Jordan. And here's a picture of what it may have looked like at the actual Jordan. And here is how it may have looked, perhaps at a spot similar to the way this one looks. As soon as they get into the Promised Land, they're ordered to go into Jericho, a fortified city. Maybe you've heard the song before. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho and the walls come tumbling down. Yeah, you remember that. Hey, God says march, march, march 6 times around that city. We're not going to go to battle. We're just going to march. And on that 7th time around the city, on the 7th day, I want you to shout a great shout. and the walls came tumbling down. It was a miraculous victory. As soon as they got into the promised land, God demonstrated His power one more time. However, that victory at Jericho, where the walls came tumbling down, was quickly met with defeat. That is, God's orders to, upon entering the promised land, destroy everything, dedicate everything to Him in destruction, including people. Dedicate them to God in destruction. Those orders were disobeyed, and we find ourselves in Joshua 7. I want you to look at this, Joshua chapter 7. Starting in verse 1. It says, the people of Israel broke faith in regard to the devoted things. For Achan, the son of Carmi, son of Zabdi, son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah, took some of the devoted things. He didn't devote it to destruction, he took it. Took them and kept them. And the anger of the Lord burned against the people of Israel. Joshua sent men from Jericho to Ai, which is near Beth-aven, east of Bethel, and said to them, go up and spy out the land. And the men went up and spied out Ai. Verse 3 of chapter 7. And they returned to Joshua and said, don't have all the people go up. Just 2,000 or 3,000 men, let them go up and attack Ai. Don't make the whole people toil up there for their few. So about 3,000 men went up, and they fled before the men of Ai. And the men of Ai killed about 36 of their men and chased them before the gates as far as Shebarim and struck them at the descent, and the hearts of the people melted and became like water. They lost this battle at Ai because of Achan's sin. It's called disobedience. And so they find out about Achan and his disobedience, and they stone him to death. And then, once disobedience is purged from among the people of Israel, they just start rolling through the promised land. I want you to turn over to Joshua chapter 12. Look at Joshua chapter 12. Starting in verse 7. I want you to look at the list of the kings defeated as they roll through this new land promised to them. Joshua chapter 12, verse 7. And these are the kings of the land whom Joshua and the people of Israel defeated on the west side of the Jordan from some locations. Now jump down to verse 9. Counting the kings, here they are. Defeated kings. The king of Jericho, 1. The king of Ai, which is beside Bethel, 1. The king of Jerusalem, 1. The king of Hebron, 1. The king of Jarmuth, 1. The king of Lachish, 1. The king of Eglon, 1. The king of Gedzer, 1. The king of Debir, 1. The king of Geder, 1. The king of Hormah, 1. The king of Arad, 1. The king of Libnah, 1. The king of Adullam, 1. You get the point, don't you? We could keep going through there. There's a bunch of them. Because, why? Because of God's promise and their obedience, they're rolling through the promised land. How long did it take them to achieve these victories? Well, we can figure that out, actually, by dating Caleb, the other of the faithful spies. Look at Joshua chapter 14. Verse 7. Caleb speaking says, I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land. And I brought him word that was in my heart. So when they spied out the land, Caleb was 40 years old. Now verse 10. And now, behold, the Lord has kept me alive, just as he said, these 45 years hence. You see that? Since the time the Lord spoke this word to Moses while Israel walked in the wilderness, and now behold, I am this day 85 years old. He was 40 when they went in to spy out the land. He's 85 now. So let's do the math. If he was 40 when they went in, and then the people of Israel didn't go in, and they wandered for 38 and a half years, that equals 78 and a half. years old. Well, now he's 85. So that leaves about 6 to 7 years where they were actually entering and conquering in that promised land. So it looks like it took about 6 or 7 years to overcome the inhabitants of the promised land. And this book of Joshua really has two major divisions, and you can see it here. In chapters 1 through 12, it's about taking the land. And in chapters 13 through 24, it's about dividing up the land. And so they do. They divide up the land that they conquered by the tribes of Israel. And the chapters on dividing up the land in Joshua's book might seem kind of boring, to be honest with you, unless you were a slave and a wanderer. And then your own little piece of ground may actually mean quite a lot. I want you to look at Joshua chapter 23. Joshua 23, as we're coming to a close of this book already. Verses 1 and 2. Joshua 23, verse 1. It says, a long time afterward, when the Lord had given rest to Israel from all their surrounding enemies. They conquered, now they're resting. And Joshua was old and well advanced in years. Verse 2, Joshua summoned all Israel, its elders and heads, its judges and officers, and said to them, I'm now old and well advanced in years. So what Joshua is going to do is he's going to give a speech, a dying word, if you will, to the people of Israel. And what he shares with them is remarkably similar to something we've already seen earlier in Joshua. Joshua chapter 23, verse 6, and you don't have to look at it in your Bible, look at it here on the screen. It says, be very strong. This is Joshua's message to Israel as he's getting ready to pass. Be very strong. Be careful to obey all that is written in the book of the law of Moses without turning aside to the right or the left. Now we place that beside what God spoke to Joshua at the death of Moses before they went into the promised land in Joshua chapter 1 verse 7, where it says, be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Notice the similarity? If it was a message from God for Joshua and that was good enough, well, he's going to share the same message from himself to the people of Israel. And then he gathers all Israel together beyond the leaders, and in chapter 24 we read this. Joshua 24, starting in verse 1. Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem, and summoned the elders, the heads, the judges, and the officers of Israel, and they presented themselves before God. And Joshua said, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, long ago your fathers lived beyond the Euphrates, Terah, the father of Abraham, and Nahor, and they served other gods. Verse 3, then I took your father Abraham from beyond the river and led him through all the land of Canaan and made his offspring many. Remember the seed promise? And I gave him Isaac. And to Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau, and I gave Esau the hill country of Seir to possess, but Jacob and the children went down to Egypt. I hope you're reading along with me. Verse 5, and I sent Moses and Aaron, and I plagued Egypt with what I did in the midst of it, and afterward I brought you out, the Exodus. Verse 6, then I brought your fathers out of Egypt, and you came to the sea, the Red Sea, and the Egyptians pursued your fathers with chariots and horsemen to the Red Sea. And when they cried to the Lord, he put darkness between you and the Egyptians, and made the sea come upon them and cover them. And your eyes saw what I did in Egypt, and you lived in the wilderness a long time. 38 and a half years, exactly. Then I brought you to the land of the Amorites, who lived on the other side of the Jordan. And they fought with you, and I gave them into your hand, and you took possession of their land, and I destroyed them from before you. And then Balak, the son of Zippor, king of Moab, arose and fought against you. And he sent and invited Balaam, the son of Beor, to curse you. That's a talking donkey story, in case you ever want to read it. It's pretty cool. But I didn't listen to Balaam, verse 10. Indeed, he blessed you instead of cursed you, so I delivered you out of his hand. Verse 11, and you went over the Jordan, a dried up Jordan, and came to Jericho, and the leaders of Jericho fought against you, and they walked around the walls of Jericho, 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 and the walls came tumbling down. And so he also gave into your hands the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And I gave them all into your hand. Verse 12, and I sent the hornet out before you, which drove them out, the 2 kings of the Amorites. It was not by your sword or by your bow. It's a little cryptic. We're not sure what that means. Verse 13, I gave you a land on which you had not labored, and cities that you had not built, for you to dwell in. You eat the fruit of vineyards and olive orchards you did not plant. This is Joshua talking. Now therefore fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. Here it is, verse 15. Put your eyes on it. And if it's evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in the land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. How many times have you heard that verse? But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And I want to let you know that's more than a nice household decorative statement. It's more than something to put above your door when you're walking into the kitchen. It's a statement. What a choice to be made. And it's an individual choice. Joshua's saying, look, people, you've seen what God did miraculously. You've experienced His goodness. And is His goodness going to be responsive in your faithfulness? He says, as for me and my house, individually, we're going to serve the Lord. What about you, church? What about you, person who's listening today? What a choice to be made. And some of us have had good examples to lead us into that choice. Some of us have. Good examples like Joshua's or Abraham's, that can draw from their past, their parents or their grandparents, older Christians who cared about them and got them on the right path. Others perhaps have had bad examples, like some Achans in their past who were disobedient. Fathers who didn't have any use for religion or stayed home and just left a child's spiritual nurturing up to the mother or no one in particular. Some have chosen to serve the Lord despite their checkered past. The most difficult part I have found is the person feeling as though if they choose to serve the Lord, they are in some way condemning those of their past in their family who didn't make that choice. But brother or sister, don't let that stop you from making the same choice that Joshua put before the people of Israel. Look, if it seems evil for you to serve the Lord and you want to serve other gods, he's basically saying do it. But as for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. Won't you make that choice? Because it doesn't matter what your past is. Give me 5 more minutes to show you why. You see, in Joshua, that statement about serving the Lord is more than a home decor. It is more important than any other life decision you can make. And the story of redemption and choosing in Joshua through the life of a prostitute named Rahab reveals that. I want you to turn back to Joshua chapter 2. Promise, 5 minutes or less. Joshua chapter 2. We read in James chapter 2, verse 25, that this Rahab was a prostitute. Think about that checkered past. Here it is on the screen. In the same way, was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies? You remember when they went in to the promised land to spy it out? She looked after them. And she sent those who pursued them off in a different direction. Rahab, checkered, past. But look at Joshua chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. Recounting what happened, Joshua the son of Nun sent 2 men secretly from Shittim and spies, saying, "Go view the land, especially Jericho." And they went, and they came into the house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab, and they lodged there. Here's Rahab's story. Not the earlier spying out. If I misspoke, sorry about that. It's the spying out of Jericho. Verse 2, "And it was told to the king of Jericho, Behold, men of Israel have come here tonight to search out the land." They found out the spies were there in Rahab's house. And in chapter 2, verse 4, it says, "But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them. And she said, True, the men came to me, but I did not know where they were from." And you can read or discuss the rest of the story maybe in the adult Bible study tonight at Sunday night. But the story is that she is considered righteous because of her act of hiding the spies for Israel. Now Rahab saved those from the raid of those who were after them. But that's not all. You see, if you were to turn to the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, Hebrews chapter 11, and if you would run through all the names of those great cloud of witnesses, that great wall of fame, wall of faith that is outlined in Hebrews chapter 11, by the time you got to verse 31, I think you would note an interesting name that appears there. And I'm going to let you look it up yourself. But that's not all. When tracing the lineage of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, guess whose name you find in verse 5? That's right. What a wonderful scarlet thread of God's grace is found in this story of Rahab, an individual who chose, like Joshua, to serve the Lord and is counted in the genealogy of our Lord Jesus Christ, a prostitute made new. You wonder if you can't make that same choice? It's open to anyone and everyone. And it's more needed today in your life than ever before. Choose this day whom you will serve. And that decision may be a once and for all writing of a big check, or it may be something that is done individually and incrementally every single day, every single hour of your life. But choose this day and know that the scarlet thread of God's grace continues to cover our flaws and our failures. That's what we find in this book of Joshua. And I hope you're inspired by it. That the God who dries up seas and dries up rivers can take care easily of the sin stain upon your life so that you are washed upon choosing to follow Him of any checkering in your past that may hold you back. So delay no longer today. Today is the day of the salvation. Joshua said, choose you this day. Today is the day. If you have a decision to make to follow Him, today is the day. Choose you this day whom you will serve. As for me and that gal behind the camera, we will serve the Lord.